Hello everyone. I will be presenting both the methodology and some potential applications of a high-resolution soil organic carbon map over South Africa, which has been produced predominantly with remote sensing and machine learning techniques. This project or this work was done in my capacity both as a researcher at the Norwegian Institute for Nature Research, but also as a consultant at ZSV Consulting in South Africa. It was done in collaboration with Heidi Hawkins and Michael Kramer from University of Cape Town and Conservation South Africa, and Anthony Mills from C4 Eco Solutions. Soil organic carbon, referred to as SOC in this presentation, is an important part of the global carbon cycle, and it's becoming increasingly important as a nature-based solution to climate change. South Africa is slightly different to the Northern Hemisphere and the tropics in that a large part of the total carbon pool is stored below ground as opposed to above ground, and therefore one cannot cut and paste soil carbon sequestration initiatives that have been developed in the Northern Hemisphere to ecosystems here in South Africa. So it's important to quantify soil organic carbon here, and to also link it to management activities and land use changes like bush encroachment, sustainable water use, agricultural productivity. To do that, we need soil organic carbon maps, and at the moment there are a few in South Africa, firstly being the Soil Grids map, which is a global data set at 250 meter resolution, and it has local inaccuracies as with many global data sets. Then we have the Department of Environmental Affairs Carbon Atlas map, which is at 1 kilometer resolution, developed with a geostatistical model, but the methods have not been very well documented, and it's not easy to repeat this methodology at regular intervals over time. Then there's also a map by Schultz and Schutter in 2020, which was based on terrain unit spatial resolution. But there are large sections of the map missing where there was no soil survey data to intersect with the terrain units. We have a wealth of soil organic carbon survey data or ground truth data in South Africa, as illustrated by the points on this map. We consolidated and collected data from the Agricultural Research Council, International Soil Reference and Information Center, and research-based private collections maintained by Heidi Hawkins and Anthony Mills. And the distribution of these samples over time range from the 1980s to present, and also a wide range of soil organic carbon values covering the gradient from west to east of the country. Using the soil organic carbon ground truth data, again illustrated in this map, in combination with satellite imagery from the Landsat satellite archive, which is a combination of 3 satellites that have taken images of the Earth at 30 meter spatial resolution going back all the way to the 80s. We use the satellite spectral data along with some climatic and edaphic variables to calibrate a machine learning model that could then extrapolate or predict soil organic carbon values across the areas without soil sample data. And we did this for multiple years over the past 30 years to quantify also the soil organic carbon change in a spatially explicit manner to create a map for the whole of South Africa. The predictions from the model are presented in this map of soil organic carbon over the country, and this inset graph shows the distribution of soil organic carbon across the different biomes, and you can see forest having the highest density and succulent karoo having the lowest density. We estimate a total topsoil soil organic carbon pool of 5.6 petagrams of carbon, and this is restricted to natural areas. We did not include cultivated lands. The median soil organic carbon density was 6 kilograms carbon per meter squared, and grasslands contribute the most to this total soil organic carbon stock given their large spatial distribution. We also quantified the error associated with these model predictions, and the mean absolute error was 1.43 kilograms of carbon per meter squared. In comparison to the other maps, the map that we produced was at a higher spatial resolution, 30 meters, but we also compared the accuracy of the predictions to the ground truth data as a form of validation. We found that our map produced an R² of about 0.58 with a mean absolute error of 1.43. Compared to the Department of Environmental Affairs, this is slightly higher, and it's also higher than the map by Schultz and Schutter. And finally, it's higher than the Soil Grids global map and also shows less bias in that it doesn't underpredict soil organic carbon at the higher end and overpredict at the lower end. Another way to compare the maps is just visually at a landscape scale. We see the satellite image of a landscape in the Eastern Cape, and the soil organic carbon is displayed on the other maps with this color bar. And here is the map we produced at 30-meter resolution, and you can see the detail that the map picks out in terms of a spatial variation of soil organic carbon. And compared to maps by the Department of Environmental Affairs, Schultz and Schutter, and soil grids, you can see that they lose the landscape scale variation in soil organic carbon given their spatial resolution. Once we calculated the soil organic carbon average, we did this using the model for the years going back to 1986. And we found that over 35 years, soil organic carbon underwent a net increase of 0.5% relative to the long-term mean. And the greatest increases were found in the grassland, and the greatest decreases were found in the Karoo biomes. And this map here shows the spatial distribution of these soil organic carbon trends, with blue areas showing increases and brown areas showing decreases in soil organic carbon. Looking at the soil organic carbon change map at a landscape scale, you can see that it distinguishes fence line contrasts in presumably management activity. In this camp, there's been an increase in soil organic carbon relative to the neighboring camps, which is something that is difficult to pick out in this very high resolution satellite image. Along this river, there's been a clearing of woody plant cover, and that is reflected in the decline in soil organic carbon. Here is another two examples where harvesting of thicket in the Eastern Cape has led to a decrease in soil organic carbon, and in this patch of what used to be speckboom has been overbrowsed, and presumably that has been the cause of this decline in soil organic carbon. It's important to note that we did not have time series soil organic carbon available to validate or give an accuracy estimate or uncertainty estimate to these trend maps. And we also were not able to distinguish between land use and climate changes, and this will require further research and analysis to achieve. Finally, I'd like to explore some of the applications and use cases of a soil organic carbon map and a trend map like the ones I presented. Some of the research applications include exploring the drivers of soil organic carbon change. Now that we have a map of where soil organic carbon has increased and decreased, we can overlay this with layers of disturbances like herbivory and fire, or abiotic drivers like rainfall, and look at how these relate to each other over space and time. You can also use it as an input into biogeochemical models, both to calibrate and to validate the models. And finally, we can use it as a way to stratify sampling designs. So if you want to develop a soil carbon survey, you can use this map to identify areas of low and high carbon where you can locate your sampling sites so that you cover the range in the distribution of soil organic carbon density. We can also use maps like this in carbon market applications. This is a slightly cynical illustration of soil carbon markets, but I think you need some healthy skepticism when it comes to this. But a soil carbon map like this can be used to estimate soil organic carbon baseline values, and this can be fed into other process-based models that are used in Vera models like the VM32. It can also be used to potentially calculate carbon dioxide equivalence and the sequestration potential of a piece of land, both by comparing a piece of land to its state in the past and identifying a trajectory of where it's likely to go in the future, and also comparing a piece of land to a reference area or a quote-unquote pristine area nearby. And this GIF shows soil organic carbon for a patch of thicket in the Eastern Cape, and here this illustrates digitizing a polygon over this and then calculating the relative difference in soil organic carbon for the surrounding camps, or every single surrounding pixel relative to the average for this polygon. And this can be a powerful tool for decision making, but also for verifying and monitoring carbon units or carbon dioxide equivalents for a piece of land over time. That's the end of my talk, and I'd like to leave you with some take-home messages. Firstly, we're entering an age of satellite data, big data, and the ability to process this data with machine learning that's allowing us to monitor things like soil organic carbon over time and quantify this at large spatial scales. Secondly, ground truth data is very important because it's used to calibrate these models, and particularly we need data on soil organic carbon trends or repeated measures at the same point over time to calibrate and validate our models. Then the potential for increases in soil organic carbon might be limited given that there is an upper limit to the capacity for soils to store carbon, and a map like this can help inform what this limit is. And finally, there are applications for these soil organic carbon maps and trend maps in both research but also as a tool for carbon markets for estimating sequestration potential and verifying change over time. Please feel free to reach out if you have more questions.
Good morning, everyone. I'll be presenting on the effects of fire and herbivory on soil organic carbon stocks and soil greenhouse gases from South African grasslands and savannas, and also at what the implications are for global change. Here is a graphic showing the global carbon budgets, and of particular importance to this presentation is this section showing the amount of carbon stored in global soils, which is between 1,500 to 2,400 gigatons of carbon. And if you compare that to what is stored in above ground vegetation, you can see the immense difference in the magnitude of the storage potential of these two different carbon sinks. As such, soils are very important as sinks or as sources of greenhouse gases, depending on different land uses or also land use change. Here is a conceptual diagram illustrating our hypothesis in terms of the effects of fire and of herbivory. For example, we hypothesize that herbivores that either grazing or browsing on these low nutrient soils would result in low nutrient litter being taken to the soil and then converted to organic matter, but this organic matter is low in nutrients. As such, it takes time to be decomposed by microbes, therefore becomes recalcitrant and is added to the soil organic carbon pool. Whereas fire as well produces compounds like ash and also pyrogenic carbon, which is also recalcitrant and takes a very long time to be decomposed by microbes, thereby being added to the soil organic carbon pool. As well, with fire, you get nutrient volatilization, and nutrients like nitrogen are burnt out, and you end up with less. The litter that remains is less carbon, there's less nitrogen, and therefore you'd expect when nitrification and denitrification processes happen, you less nitrous oxide are released. When as well in terms of methane, when fire burns, you get death of methanotrophs or methanotrophic bacteria, resulting in less conversion or less uptake of methane into the soil, thereby increasing your methane uptakes, your methane emissions. To test this hypothesis, we selected 3 sites. One site in the Brotherton Plateau atop the Drakensberg mountain range, where there is an experimental burn trial going on there, and then the other 2 sites we selected from the savannah in Kruger National Park, where there's also an experimental burn trial and also long-term ecological research sites there. This is just a general location of the sites with respect to South Africa. There you see the zoomed out map of Brotherton, of the old Drakensberg mountain range, but showing your location of Brotherton as well as for Kruger National Park, and then show the respective locations of the Satara and Kuhlu trials. This is how the sites are laid out in the ground. For example, in Brotherton, yeah, this is this area here. This is the boundary of the fire trial, and then we have a fire break outside that area, and also the rest of the park. So these different areas gave us our different treatments. For example, beaver and biennial fire outside the park, outside in the park, and then within that fire break you have beaver and annual fire, and then within the trial now you get different as well fire treatments without herbivore. So annual fire, biennial fire, or no disturbance. And then in the savannah we have Nguhlu, where this blue and orange part represent the exclusion, where herbivores are excluded, whilst these 2 areas herbivores are allowed movement, but this area there's no burning, whereas here there's burning. And then in Satara we have these are all burn plots, and then we selected a no disturbance plot, a plot that is burnt annually, and one that is burnt every 3 years. And then these green dots show the location of the herbivore exclosures that are within those sites, that I'll show in the next slide. So this slide shows the landscape or how the sites look like, and you can see the visual differences among these sites. For example, in Kuhlu, you can see the difference between the no disturbance plot, which looks like a thicket, compared to all these other 3 plots which are a bit more open. And then in Satara, these are the rings which exclude herbivores. So inside there you'd get data or you get soils that have been exposed to herbivore, soils plus vegetation. And then in the grassland, this is within the fire trial, and this is outside the fire break, and that's in the fire break. So we sampled soils in all these sites at a depth of 20 centimeters and collected also this other data, above ground biomass, that is foliar and litter biomass, and also wood biomass, and including microbial biomass from the soils. And for greenhouse gases, we also inserted soil collars, and then used an infrared gas analyzer, which was fitted with a dynamic chamber to measure carbon dioxide fluxes. Whereas for CH4 and N2O, we used static chambers, which were inserted, and then an air sample would be taken, which was later analyzed via gas chromatography to determine the concentrations of these two gases. We also conducted soil chemical and physical property analysis, for example, for your elements, pH, soil texture. We'll get on to the results now. So in the savanna mainly we had neutral effect. We didn't have any differences in soil carbon stocks, as you can see from the graphs there, and the post-hoc analysis, as well as in Kuhlu. But in the grassland we did get higher carbon stocks, soil carbon stocks with fire. For example, this is an annual fire area, and this is a biennial fire area, and we had the highest stocks in those two areas as compared to the other treatments. With respect to carbon dioxide fluxes, we also had a similar trend where in the savanna, in either Satara or Nkutlu, we had no differences in the fluxes, even though they are quite high, but there were no differences across all treatments, same as in Nkutlu as well. But you can see Satara is the highest fluxes in general compared to Nkutlu. Whereas in Brotherton, we also got the annual fire and biennial fire, the no fire treatment at the least carbon dioxide fluxes. Whereas this area shows, this is what we did in the lab where we removed roots from the soils and measured respiration again to determine fluxes. So this represented the component contributed by soil microbes. As you can see, there were no differences at all. For methane and nitrous oxide, we found, for example, for methane that generally methane was fixed by methanotrophs or methanotrophic bacteria into the soil, which is shown here by the negative values, which shows that it's a negative flux. Methane is going to the soil, which also happened here, and similarly in coffee as well. And then as for nitrous oxide, even though we had some differences here in Satara, what was important with these results is the overall magnitude of these values. You can see that they are very small, and they are quite negligible, which is sort of in line with what is found in these areas. Some other studies have shown these very small values of nitrous oxides, showing that our soils, even in Southern Africa, release very little to nothing in terms of N2O fluxes. So from those results, we created a partial carbon budget, which is comparable, or we might compare to that global carbon budget that I presented in the second slide in the introduction. Our grassland is in average 18,000 grams per cow of carbon per square meter, which is around should be 18 tons per hectare, whereas the savanna is that much. And then in general, after converting all the gases into carbon dioxide equivalents, we found that the savanna is releasing more in carbon dioxide equivalents compared to the grassland. And to these values, we'll further compare them with the recent map by Venda et al. Showing the different soil carbon stocks in different biomes in South Africa. So this map is from Venda et al. 2021, showing all the different biomes in South Africa. And for example, in the grassland, would see that our figure of 18,000 would fall somewhere here, which is just above their range. Whereas in the savanna, the figures that we obtained fall within the range that Venda et al. Mapped out. In general, we found neutral effects in the savanna for either soil organic carbon or soil greenhouse gases. And we think that this lack of differences may be attributed to the fact that our savannas, as well as grasslands in general, have co-evolved with fire and herbivory. And as such, any changes that happen above ground, either burning off of vegetation or grazing of vegetation, compaction of soil, deposition of urine, dung, all those above ground changes take time to detect to become changes or in the soil. For example, now when you start measuring soil organic carbon and other soil parameters, you don't get to see those differences that we would have expected uh, based on those based on the magnitude of differences, magnitude of disturbances above ground. And we think this also contributes in a way to the stability of these soils, because these soils are so resistant to what to change. You'd you don't get uh, you don't get emissions, for example, of carbon dioxide and nitrous oxides. You don't get so many of them, and as well, our soils have been shown to be a huge sink of methane, which takes up that greenhouse gas from the atmosphere. So the major gas that has been released from our soils is carbon dioxide, but then has been shown to also go down. We did not carry out our studies uh, in the dry season, but it is from literature it's expected that these fluxes of, for example, of carbon dioxide would go down during the dry season because of the reduction in activity of microbes of above ground vegetation as well, so which means root respiration goes down as well. So in general, we recommend low frequency fires, managed grazing to better increase soil carbon stocks and also reduce soil greenhouse gas emissions in our grasslands and savannas. Thank you.
Morning, everyone. I'll be talking to you about using modeling as a starting point for discussion with communities on communal rangelands for better land use planning and then possibly carbon projects on these lands. So Griscom and colleagues have pointed out that besides clean energy, 30% of our climate mitigation targets can come from protecting, managing, and restoring natural lands. And this includes grasslands. So there is the possibility of getting carbon credits from these areas. But if we look at global carbon stocks by ecosystem, and I think many of us have heard that the carbon density of the amount of carbon per unit area in mangroves is quite high. But of course, their area is quite small, and so the estimated global carbon content from mangroves is significant but relatively low. On the other hand, forests have a high carbon density and a large extent and therefore contribute a lot towards global carbon, and that's why there's a lot of emphasis on tree planting, for example. And peatlands also have high carbon density, but my point is here that our grasslands, although they have relatively low carbon density, except for the montane grasslands, which are quite high, because grasslands have this large global extent, they contribute about 8.5% of the world's carbon. And as we heard from Xander's talk, we know that the South African grasslands have about the third highest carbon density, so amount of carbon per unit area. And then the grasslands are quite large in extent in South Africa, so they end up contributing the most amount of soil organic carbon in the country. Besides carbon, grasslands provide water and forage ecosystem services and therefore livelihoods and cultural values that are associated with them. However, communal grasslands are threatened by unplanned grazing and fires with subsequent erosion, and as we can see here, by invasive plants such as wattle. The work I'm going to show you is part of a project with Coventry University, Rhodes, Stellenbosch and Conservation South Africa called TOCASA. That's trade-offs in communal areas in South Africa, and you can look more about the project following this link, and there's also a YouTube of some of our workshops. And here you can see James, who's the leader of the project from Coventry, with Tony Palmer. We're standing with the herd monitors in the Eastern Cape grasslands, and you can see some of the little bit of erosion and obviously the wattle. So Conservation South Africa works with communities via conservation agreements in order to restore grasslands, and where one of the main activities is a shift from continuously grazed, unrestricted livestock movements to a planned grazing situation where you've got an area that can be rested, another area which is grazed, in exchange for incentives such as training around animal husbandry, but also forage, vaccinations of animals, and market access. So within the Umzimvubu catchment, one of the many communal areas where Conservation South Africa works is Mvinyani, which you see here. And then on the left, we can see several villages within that communal area where they've had their conservation areas mapped out, including the grazed and ungrazed areas, their wattle areas, and so on. So the idea is that if we shift from the continuous high-pressure grazing to moderate grazing and fire regimes, we can increase the primary production of grass and carbon sequestration via that grass sward with uncertain trade-offs for water and nutrient cycling. Now we have little long-term data from those communal areas, so we are using long-term data from experimental sites together with models to simulate carbon water production trade-offs, and then adjusting those models for the communal sites. And then we take those models to stakeholder groups and work with them to co-design land use plans that are suitable for them, but also increase climate resilience. So we adjusted the model parameters, the biogeochemical models we're using, Spaxis and Daysend, using long-term data from the Brotherton burning trial in Drakensberg. And we have various fire and herbivory treatments, which don't matter exactly what they are for now. The point is that we had reasonable correlation between measured and modeled herbaceous biomass, and also using other model fit tests, and also a reasonable overlap in phenology between the model and the measured herbaceous biomass. And also, if we look at soil organic carbon, then we see that the measured soil carbon overlaps well with the modeled carbon as well, and the trend in how the different treatments affect that. So now we can apply that model to the Mvenyani communal area using the local climate and soil as inputs. And what we see here is the herbaceous biomass. We have the model rested area in blue and the model unrested area in the red. And then down below we have the measured rested and unrested in the green and purple. And we can already see something is strange there because they are both the same. So when we come to the unrested area, the overlap between the measured and the model is quite good. There, it's that red line is the model, and then the purple line is the measured. However, if we look at the rested area, the model gives us herbaceous biomass that we might expect. However, those values and the pattern of the curve do not overlap with what we measured, which is the green over there. So this implies that that area actually wasn't rested, and indeed that was the case. The community does have a challenge with trespassing livestock either from their own areas or from neighbors, especially with no fences and so on. And it has stimulated action. There's been meetings about it and increased monitoring from our side and their side, and we're starting in this season now to see improved biomass in some areas of the communal area. Okay, if we come to soil organic carbon, there was a good overlap between the measured and the modeled soil organic carbon, especially in the day cent, but both models perform pretty well. So now we can go on to look at the model predictions and different scenarios. So there are many different scenarios we can have, but we had a look at what happens if you have no grazing, if you have continuous grazing at high pressure, or continuous grazing at low to moderate pressure, compared to a two-camp system, low moderate grazing with or without fire. And what we see is that compared to the continuous grazing there, we will definitely see more herbaceous biomass with any of the other scenarios, but of course we're not going to have no grazing, and we have pretty high biomass with the two-camp system with or without fire. And then we expect over time to see that soil organic carbon increase when we move away from the continuous grazing. Now I want to show you some preliminary wattle findings. If we look at one of these planned graze scenarios, so for example the two-camp moderate grazing and fire, and we apply a business as usual future climate scenario, this one here, my colleague Mustafa, using the Spaxis model, has had a look at herbaceous biomass without, that's the blue, or with wattle, that's the pink. And he finds a variation within years. And if we look at the empirical data on this from Onelena Guata, Tony Palmer and others, they also found the biomass of the grass that will very much depend on the wattle density. And in fact, if you thin the wattle rather than clear cut or have dense stands, you can have more herbaceous biomass. And if we look at the carbon, what's quite surprising is that over time with the wattle you can have less soil organic carbon according to the model, and if we come to the empirical data on this, it's quite variable. You can have a higher, the lower, or same. There's not many studies on this, so I think that this is a very interesting area to look at, and the point is we should not just assume that with this tree in the landscape we will have higher SOC. Then when we come to the water, all the studies, haven't listed them all here, but agree that wattle will generally result in lower soil moisture with the wattle. The model shows that this is the case, but only sometimes. I think we still need to work on this part of the model, but it's going to be very interesting. Our next step is to discuss this with our stakeholders and focus groups, obviously when COVID allows. And then we will use conceptual models like this one to present the various scenarios of alternative use in wattle invaded rangeland using, the models that I've shown you, as well as discussion. And so an example would be, we would look at a wattle invaded rangeland, have a look at various model scenarios and say, well, if you clear or thin this area, we do expect, of course, to reduce the wattle, and then this will have an impact on the timber and fuel wood availability, and then potentially the income, mostly of men who work with the timber. But then on the other hand, we expect with wattle clearing to increase grass production, and then this should provide more forage for animals and therefore more income, also mostly for men in this case. But if we also consider we may have more thatch grass, and this is something that is often collected by women and could possibly even be sold, then it may have a favorable outcome for women. And we also would want to look at the trade-offs with water flows, as I've mentioned, and also we may see more or less carbon sequestration with that wattle thinning or clearing, and with implications for carbon finance projects and even income for the supplemental income for the community. So I want to conclude by saying that wattle could reduce soil organic carbon, and we predict with planned grazing that we can increase the soil organic carbon sequester about 1 ton of carbon per hectare per year. And this is a small but potentially meaningful amount for carbon finance projects. And so this is something that could contribute towards climate adaptation of the area through income from these projects, and also mitigation via applying some kind of verified carbon standard, which Leon will tell you about later in the session. And then because we also expect with the planned grazing and other activities to have attending biodiversity and social benefits, we could apply, for instance, one of the climate, community and biodiversity standards that may be more applicable to this area. So I want to thank my colleagues who have been involved with supplying data and opinions, and also to the funders. And then thanks to you for listening.
Hello and welcome. This is a talk about how cattle and other wildlife species affect soil carbon as well as other nutrients in the soil. This is work that was published last year in Nature Sustainability and was led by Judith Sitters along with other collaborators. My name is Duncan Kimuyu and I'm going to take you through the presentation. African grasslands support large densities of diverse wildlife species, and in addition to this, they have also supported thriving livestock production industries. And livestock and wildlife have coexisted in these grasslands for a long period of time. However, we are increasingly beginning to worry about the future of coexistence of these species, particularly because of concerns relating to human-wildlife conflicts, livestock depredation, disease transmission, aspects of competition for forage and water, but also issues related to degradation. And you see in some of the areas where overgrazing has been done for a long period of time, you get these barren stretches of land that are widespread. To understand the nature of interactions between livestock and wildlife and the implications that they have on biodiversity, we need long-term experiments that monitor changes over time. And one of such long-term experiments is based here in Kenya, an experiment that was established in 1995 by Truman Young, the Kenya Long-Term Exclosure Experiment. The goal for this experiment is to tease apart the impacts of cattle and different groups of wildlife on each other, but also to understand the implications they have on the landscape. The experiment uses two types of fences to keep away different combinations of herbivores. There's this high fence that excludes elephants and giraffe, the two mega herbivores in the system. And there is the multiple strand fence that excludes most of the other wild herbivores except for the very small ones like steinbuck. Based on the particular group of herbivore that is excluded from the plots, we have 6 different herbivore treatments with the letters there denoting the group that is allowed to come in a particular plot. 0 being plots that are completely fenced out from all herbivores. C being plots where cattle are allowed. W being plot where wild mesoherbivores are allowed. And M being plots where megaherbivores are allowed. So you can see there are different combinations of the letters there denoting the different combinations of herbivores that are allowed in each of our plots. So each of the plot measures 200 by 200 meters, that's 4 hectares, and each of the treatment is replicated 3 times for a total of 18 different plots. These are the 7 species that are common in our study plots, 2 megaherbivores and 5 mesoherbivores. Using these exclosures, we have been able to test multiple interactions and trophic cascades, as you can see from this diagram. My focus today is on some work that we did with Judy Sitters, examining the impact these different groups of herbivores could have on soil carbon as well as other nutrient pools. One thing that is consistent with both traditional and modern livestock management practices involve grazing livestock across the landscape and returning them at night to these semi-permanent structures that are designed to protect them from predators at night. This may be occupied for a few months to a year or so, but then after some time the livestock have to be moved to other places. By the time they move out, they leave behind these huge piles of dung, and the implication for this is that cattle are grazing across the landscape and accumulating nutrients in this one spot at night. Long after livestock have moved out, these features remain with elevated nutrients. They attract unique grass species, and they are maintained by both cattle and wildlife as grazing lawns. However, there is an emerging trend where dung from these sites is now being harvested and sold as manure to farmers elsewhere. So, as I said earlier, our goal for this work was to test the extent to which cattle and other wildlife species could affect the level of soil carbon as well as other nutrients in the soil. We collected soil samples from each of the clay exclosure plots and analyzed them for nutrients. These 3 graphs show a summary of our findings for each of the 3 elements that we analyzed. On the x-axis, we have the different herbivore treatments, and the green boxes are areas underneath trees, and golden boxes are areas away from tree canopies for each of the different herbivore treatments. As you can see from these graphs, plots that are grazed by cattle alone, that is C, and plots that are grazed by cattle and wild mesoherbivores, that is WC, have consistently low soil carbon and soil nitrogen. And this is an indication that cattle are actually exporting nutrients from the plots by grazing and depositing the dung elsewhere. In sharp contrast, and this is the most exciting finding from our work, plots that cattle share with mega herbivores and other species of wildlife, the negative effect of cattle on soil nutrients are actually reversed. We're comparing MWC, in this case a plot with mega herbivores, with C and WC, both of which have cattle but without mega herbivores. The negative effect that we are seeing for cattle are actually offset by presence of mega herbivores. We further interrogated the mechanisms that are contributing to the idea that elephants are reversing the negative effect of cattle on soil nutrients. And one of the mechanisms that could possibly contribute to this is the idea that elephants can actually suppress forage extraction by cattle. In our study plots, we have demonstrated that plots that are shared between elephants and cattle as a consequence of elephants depleting forbs in the grass layer, cattle spent more time moving around and searching for forbs, and consequently feeding on less grass because of the fact that the nutritious items that they are looking within the grass layer have already been depleted by elephants. The other idea is that elephants are also able to offset competition between uh, cattle and wild mesoherbivores. That wild mesoherbivores prefer hanging out in plots that are also accessible to elephants, as opposed to plots that do not have elephants but they are shared with cattle. So, by spending more time in plots that are shared between elephants and cattle, they deposit more dung in those plots, and that could accelerate or could still contribute to deposition of nutrients, or could contribute to retaining nutrients in those plots. The last mechanism relates to the idea that elephants break down trees, and we are able to demonstrate that most of the soil nitrogen that we obtained from our soil samples and is actually derived from the trees, and this is just indicating that, or further reaffirming the idea that by breaking trees, elephants are reducing or retaining nutrients in the plots where they are allowed. In conclusion, I want to point out that the effects of cattle differ remarkably from wildlife in the way they redistribute nutrients across the landscape. Cattle would tend to graze across the landscape, harvesting nutrients and depositing them in one spot, while the redistribution of nutrients by wildlife through dung is actually more homogeneous. The other aspect points to the idea that a mix of cattle and wild herbivores could actually be sustainable, but only at moderate stocking densities. Our work is conducted at stocking densities that we consider moderate, but of course, if stocking densities are increased beyond a certain level, we expect that results would be much more different from what we are reporting here. The last idea is that uh, elephants play important role in management of soil carbon as well as other nutrient dynamics by influencing the way in which cattle could redistribute nutrients across the landscape. And this is an important consequence and a pointer to the idea that management of landscape together with cattle and wildlife could in fact be more compatible to long-term maintenance of homogeneous distribution of nutrients within the soil layer. That's the end of my presentation, and thanks for having me.
Good day, my name is Leon Theron. I'll be presenting today on carbon market opportunities for African rangelands. I work for the Carbon Fund of Conservation International's Africa Field Division, and I'm based in Cape Town. There is a renewed urgency to mitigate climate change, and carbon trading is seen as an important mechanism to achieve this. Many sectors are responsible for the increases in greenhouse gas emissions. It's not only the usual suspects of electricity generation and transport. Deforestation and land use change is actually contributing up to 18% of the annual greenhouse gas emissions. Greenhouse gas trading was introduced in 1997 at the Kyoto COP. The aim was to use markets as incentives to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and thus avoiding catastrophic climate change and incentivize clean and sustainable development. The initial carbon trading system proposed was that polluters should cap their emissions to below 1990 levels, and if over that, they can buy credits from entities that have reduced to below 1990 levels or get taxed. The trade is done in tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. 1 ton of carbon dioxide equals 1 carbon credit. The cap and trade market only really took off in the European Union and a few local markets. It resulted in a voluntary market driven mainly by corporates outside of the compliance market, and it allowed for inclusion of offset sectors not allowed in the compliance market, such as regenerative agriculture. The European Union compliance market was worth some $220 billion in 2019, and credit prices have reached almost $60 a ton in 2021, with some 9 billion credits traded on the EU compliance market. In contrast, the voluntary market was worth around $282 million and credit in 2019, and credits were trading at around $8 per ton in 2021. There has been a strong upward trend in market volume, both in compliance and voluntary markets. The main carbon trading sectors are in energy, so mainly renewable energy replacing fossil fuels, manufacturing using improved efficiency and fuel switching. The agriculture sector has seen changes to no-till, reducing nitrogen fertilizers and manure management. The larger land use sector has become a big player, with avoided deforestation leading the way. Afforestation, rangeland and wetland restoration projects are also increasing. There are several global carbon standards and registries. The leading voluntary market standard is the Verified Carbon Standard, managed by an organization called Verra. It is certified by the International Organization of Standards and the American National Standards Institute. The Verified Carbon Standard is also recognized under the South African carbon tax. Land use sector carbon projects such as avoided deforestation and regenerative agriculture were not well accepted in the early days of carbon markets. This was due to the risk of reversals due to fire, land use change and other natural disasters. So basically, if you're protecting a large tract of forest, there's often a real risk that it may burn down, or it could be cleared for agriculture, thus resulting in all the conserved emissions going back into the atmosphere. This risk has largely been resolved by assessing all land use sector projects for their non-permanence risk, and a percentage of credits then has to be placed into a buffer account depending on the specific risk of the project. With the renewed demand for carbon credits, there has been an increase in methodologies based on previously neglected nature-based climate mitigation pathways. One of these pathways is African rangeland restoration. Some of the recent research includes Hawkins' work in the Eastern Cape, where she found that soil organic carbon increases when rotational grazing and biannual burning is introduced, instead of continuous grazing and annual fires. Interestingly, areas with no herbivory and no fire had lower soil organic carbon returns compared to biannual herbivory and rotational grazing. Sitters et al. Found in Kenya that changes in the herbivore species composition can increase or decrease soil organic carbon. Noticeably, the highest carbon density was found in a system with megaherbivores and livestock. Ritchie has recently developed a new VCS methodology based on his research in the Serengeti, where he developed the SNAP biogeochemical model. This new methodology allows all rangeland restoration projects that introduce rotational grazing and changes in herd structure to apply the methodology and generate carbon credits. There are also other VCS methods available for rangeland restoration activities, ranging from projects that only reduce enteric fermentation to projects that plant nitrogen fixing plants or even avoided grassland conversion projects. The applicability conditions of all these methodologies vary, and it's beyond the scope of this presentation to discuss them. But all methodologies are available on the VCS website. Next, I would like to tell you about Conservation South Africa's pilot project in the Kruger to Canyons Biosphere Reserve. This project will hopefully cover 80,000 hectares of communal rangeland. Its core activities are switching from continuous to rotational grazing, brush packing of bare patches, and changing the herd structure to younger animals. The ultimate goal of the project is to increase the herbaceous cover, and this will then lead to increased soil organic carbon sequestration. The project will use VM0032. We have completed a pilot study to assess the baseline soil carbon stocks and have run some preliminary iterations of the SNAP model, changing input parameters such as grazing intensity and herd structure. Current projections of the model suggest that the restoration activities could lead to a reduction of 2.43 tons of carbon dioxide per hectare per year. These reductions will then be verified by third-party auditors and issued as carbon credits on the VCS registry that the project can then sell to generate further income. Monitoring will be done using remote sensing and field surveys. The herd structure and movement will also be monitored throughout the project lifespan. It must be noted that all VCS projects should commit to a minimum project implementation period of 30 years, with credit generation being around around 20 years long. Carbon income is just one benefit of the project. The restoration leads to rangeland resilience. Farmers rely less on supplementary feed during droughts, and farmers are also assisted with market access for their livestock. One important component of all carbon projects is that there should be a governance structure and land management plan in place. Such governance structures and management plans improve land tenure security. The project will also create additional employment by employing herders and rangeland monitors. It must be noted that there are several hurdles into the carbon market. The first important factor is that all carbon projects must be additional. But if something is business as usual, it can't be registered as a carbon project. There must also be clear barriers to implementation. The design and implementation cost of carbon projects is also very steep. It basically is very paperwork intensive. There's a lot of the documentation that must be submitted. There's a lot of monitoring that has to be done as well, and it must be third-party verified at least every 5 years or every time credits want to be issued. This is a costly exercise. It is very difficult also to register small projects. The only way to overcome this is to group small projects together. The VCS does allow for this. Nonetheless, with increasing carbon prices, there is definitely an opportunity for rangeland restoration activities in Africa, and especially in South Africa, to register as carbon projects and generate extra income. Thank you for your time. Please feel free to contact me if you have any further questions.
Hello, thank you for joining me today for this presentation on how fire frequencies influence organic carbon stocks in mesic grasslands over time. My name is Robert Nicola and I'm currently a PhD candidate at UKZN in Pietermaritzburg. So grasslands cover a large portion of the Earth's surface and have the potential to store substantial amounts of carbon. However, this potential is dependent on how the grasslands are managed. Fire is an important ecological factor in these grassland biomes in its contribution to the control of woody species thickening and bush encroachment, and used as an important management tool in many savanna and grassland agro-ecosystems. While it's understood that the distribution of organic carbon and nitrogen within Okalinga grassland soil increments is altered by the occurrence of fire, the consideration of fire frequency and time on these biophysical processes and the resulting stability of carbon stocks remains poorly examined. The long-term burning trial at Okalinga Research Station, Pietermaritzburg, provided an ideal opportunity to examine organic carbon stocks and the turnover following a synthesis by Richard Finn in 2000 over 20 years previously. Considering the storage and sequestration of carbon in grassland systems does not have unlimited potential and will likely reach equilibrium by 20 years, we then assume soils will demonstrate relatively stable carbon stocks with land use change, in this case fire frequency, accounting for possible variation between treatments. Here we establish the status of current organic carbon stocks and observe changes in these stocks over the observed 20 years. Sequestration rate can also illustrate the changes in these rates over time. The study site was located at Okalinga Research Station in Pietermaritzburg, with the vegetation area being classified as southern tall grassveld. The long-term Okalinga burn trials were initiated to test the effect of various combinations of mowing and burning treatments on mesic grasslands. Treatment plots were replicated 3 times within a randomized block design. 10 treatments were included for the purpose of the study. Plots were left ungrazed, with treatments consisting of annual burning in winter and spring, biennial and triennial burning in winter, spring or autumn, and control treatments were left unburned, and an annual spring mow was included for comparison. Soils were collected in April this year using a handheld soil corer. 4 random representative soil cores were extracted per treatment plot. Soils were bulked and reported to a 30 centimeter depth in compliance with the IPCC recommendations. Appropriate depth error was reported in sites with shallow soils, and cores were separated into 5 centimeter increments and dried at 65 degrees Celsius for 48 hours. Soil bulk density for year 2000 was unavailable, and so estimated empirically using pedo transfer functions. Algorithms for pedo transfer functions use parameters organic matter and particle size representative of the site. Dried samples were homogenized and sieved to 0.5 of a millimeter, and then analyzed for total carbon and nitrogen using a LICO TrueSpec CN analyzer. Organic carbon concentration was estimated by converting the percentage carbon fraction present to parts per thousand by multiplying by a factor of 10, and this was expressed as grams of carbon per hectare for nominator stratum. Two-way ANOVA were used to describe the data. Following this, an overall comparison between differences was tested using a post-ANOVA Tukey HSD test. Probability values were adjusted in a pairwise t-test using the Bonferroni correction and Helm adjustments. All assumptions were satisfied. Grassland soils are demonstrating a characteristically lower nitrogen content, between 1.32 and 4.19 concentration, and a wider CN ratio under various burning frequencies. As a consequence, there are reduced inputs of nitrogen relative to carbon within the soil stratum. Nitrogen was overall very low in concentration, but any available nitrogen showed greatest quantities in the top soils and decreased with depth. Greatest variation in soil organic carbon stocks was obvious in the top 15 centimeters of soil, showing greatest quantities of soil organic carbon. From the treatments, those sites burnt biannually in the spring showed the greatest significance in terms of soil carbon stocks in the first 5 centimeters of the soil layer. Thereafter, stocks decreased steadily to 30 centimeters. Grasslands with no fire application had low stocks in the first 5 centimeters of soil, but demonstrated an overall reduced variability in terms of stock further into the soil. Carbon stocks in the no-burn treatments, the annual treatments, and the biannual burns seem to demonstrate an increase in carbon in the 3rd increment, following a drop of carbon in the 2nd increment. This pattern was not observed in the triennial burns. The lowest stock concentrations in the first 5 centimeters were observed in treatments burned triennially. Annual mow treatments indicated an increased carbon stock steadily to 15 centimeters. Thereafter, stocks dropped quite significantly. Carbon stocks calculated from year 2000 showed greater carbon stock gains in the top centimeters of soil, after which stocks decreased significantly. Following 20 years, biennial spring burns showed greatest organic carbon gains, followed by biennial autumn burns. The greatest significant sequestration rate gains were obvious in treatments burned biennially in the spring, within the first 10 centimeters of soil. Biennial burns and no-burn treatments also showed carbon sequestration gains, but not to the level of the biennial spring burns. Whilst the annual burns demonstrated a drop in carbon in the first 5 centimeters of soil, carbon gains were obvious but not significant in lower increments. The same was observed in annual mowing treatments. Biannual autumn burns and triennial burns demonstrated the greatest losses in soil carbon within all the increments over the 20 years. The results of the study highlights the importance of timing of burns in grasslands. Mesic grassland is inherently low in nitrogen, decreasing in concentration with increasing depth. The top 15 centimeters of soil show greatest carbon stocks and variation among treatments. This may be due to available nitrogen in the topsoil layers. There was also observed increased carbon in the third increments, and this was following a decline in the second increment, suggesting that carbon association within the top 10 centimeters may be more variable than the lower increments. Aside from the no burn control, and contrary to expectation, soil carbon stocks did not stabilize over the studied period of 20 years. This may infer that the application of fire as a defoliation event influences the loss and gain of total organic carbon. The no-burn control demonstrated a certain level of stabilization, which was seen throughout the increments, but no majorly significant gains or losses were observed, which may suggest that these treatments, devoid of defoliation events entirely, have or are reaching a certain level of equilibrium. To go over some of the key findings, the annual burn treatments demonstrated a drop in organic carbon, notably within the first 5 centimeters of soil, as overly frequent defoliation and reduced recovery time for grasslands may reduce the soil's capacity to build up carbon stocks in these layers. Secondly, biennial spring burns demonstrated the best practice for carbon management, where the only significant increase in carbon was observed. These treatments also demonstrated greatest carbon stocks and the greatest significant sequestration rates. Treatments with assumed greater available biomass, so the triennial and biennial autumn burns following a longer growth period, show the greatest carbon losses throughout. Longer periods of growth and buildup of greater available biomass may increase fire intensity during pyrogenic events, resulting in a greater loss of carbon material. So this is a developing project, and there is scope to understand these dynamics on a greater scale. So further investigation into fire intensity and its effects on carbon stocks in grasslands may be useful. Nitrogen availability in various burn frequencies may influence species composition, and subsequently this composition may attribute to fire intensities, and then contribution of pyrogenic events on the volatilization and availability of nitrogen in an already nitrogen deficient landscape may too account for the reduced carbon in frequently burned grasslands. Elaborating on isotopic carbon fractions and contribution of fire to stable carbon fractions in the soil and determining the long-term stability of these carbon fractions may be useful. There's also scope for establishing changes in how fire intensity and frequency influence carbon emissions. So research has suggested early season or cooler burning as well as patch burning reduce overall carbon emissions when compared to hotter fires burnt later in the season. Okay, so with that, I'd like to thank you for your time. This is a developing project, and I welcome any comments and questions. Here are my contact details. Should you have any questions on what we've chatted about today, please feel free to contact me. Thank you and goodbye.
Hello everybody, welcome to my presentation. I'm Oksana, a PhD student at the Tunen Institute, and today I'm happy to present you our research on effects of livestock grazing on carbon exchange in semi-arid Karoo ecosystems under different grazing intensities. In this study, we explored the links between net ecosystem exchange, vegetation cover, and biodiversity in response to historical and current livestock grazing. we aimed to examine and compare the interannual variability of carbon fluxes across different grazing intensities. In general, this research aims to study the behavior of ecosystem to ultimately support decision-making processes regarding sustainable management practices. Let's move to the study at sites. Here you can see the map with the circles which shows the location of our study at sites. This study is based on the 4 years of continuous eddy-covariance measurements of carbon fluxes at the semi-arid Karoo near Middelburg. Map colors represent different South African biomes. Our study sites are located in the Nama Karoo biome, which covers about 20% of the country. Nama Karoo biome characterized by the dwarf shrubs and grasses. The distance between the towers is about 1.5 kilometers. Our paired tower approach allowed for an analysis of the effects of different grazing regimes on carbon fluxes under an identical climatic condition. So let's get closer to the history of this area. The territory is a semi-arid ecosystem with a mean annual precipitation of 373 mm per year and mean annual temperature about 15 degrees. Livestock farming is considered here as a main land management practice. Topography is generally flat and weakly developed. If we come closer and compare two studied sites, the first site we named as linear grazing site, which had cycling grazing activity. For example, 2 weeks of grazing and approximately 24 to 26 weeks of resting period. And the second site we called experimental grazing. It was overgrazed in the past with a stocking rate double of recommended, after rested for 10 years, and since the end of 2017, it's again under uncontrolled continuous livestock grazing. If we would compare vegetation cover, then the LG site or linear grazing site covered by the mixture of palatable grass and dwarf shrub species preferred by sheep, so we can observe their happy faces, whereas the experimental grazing site covered mostly by unpalatable grass species and sad sheep. So the mean annual precipitation during the measurement period was nearly the same as long-term mean annual precipitation. Here we can see actual measured data of the meteorological variables from the site, like temperature, relative humidity, radiation, soil water content and precipitation, and normalized difference vegetation indexes. The gray shadows represent growing season, while blue and red shadows represent livestock grazing at the site. Looking at the graphs, we can see clear visual seasonal and diurnal cycles of our variables. Approximately 85% of precipitation occurring during the growing season, with the driest months in the winter with 10 mm of precipitation per month, and November, December as a transition months from the dry to wet season. Hereby we can observe 4 years of measured net ecosystem exchange and daytime derived gross primary production and ecosystem respiration. We can see that both ecosystems have similar peaks, but experimental grazing site has lower respiration and higher carbon uptake. First of all, we need to look at the peaks of net ecosystem exchange, which highly correlated with water availability. More precipitation events result into the longest and the biggest peaks. Thus, we see that the third year of measurement was the most productive year. During the dry season, when ecosystem is water limited, we can observe a slight carbon source ecosystem. The ecosystem is turning into the carbon sink when gross primary production is higher than ecosystem respiration, so-called physiologically active ecosystem. Also, we can see that the difference in the peaks between the sites is decreased due to the continuous heavy livestock grazing started in 2017 at the experimental grazing site. So, in general, net ecosystem exchange is strongly dependent on those two drivers, water availability and land management, in our case, livestock grazing. Here we can see the absolute ratios of gross primary production to ecosystem respiration. When ratios are higher than 1, it shows that ecosystem acted that period as a carbon sink. Most of the time we can see that ratios are more than 1 during the growing season, with few exceptions, for example July and August in 2016. Years 1 and 2 had really similar annual precipitation, but different distributions throughout the year. For example, in 2016 there was less precipitation during the growing season and more than usual in winter time. Thus, the length of growing season depends not only on the amount but also on the distribution of precipitation. Here we can observe a fingerprint map which nicely shows the differences between two studied sites. Red pattern represents carbon release, so-called carbon source ecosystem, while blue one carbon uptake. As we can see, throughout all the years, the experimental grazing site shows darker blue, which means it had higher carbon sequestration compared to the linear grazing site. As I said before, in 2016 we had less precipitation during the growing season and higher than usual amount of precipitation in wintertime, which resulted into slight carbon sinks. But if we compare it with the other years, we can see that there's almost no activity during the dry seasons. While third year, as I already mentioned, was the most productive with increased precipitation, which resulted in 5-6 months of growing season with carbon sink ecosystem. Here we can see mean diurnal net ecosystem exchange throughout 4 years of measurement period, divided by growing and dry seasons. Growing season here we consider it from January to May. As we can see, during the dry season, ecosystems stay mostly inactive. Everything was close to zero, but still we can notice some small carbon uptake peaks during the daytime. While during the growing season, we observe increased carbon sequestration. In 2016 and 2017, we can see that experimental grazing site had higher mean diurnal carbon peaks compared to the linear grazing site. Although situation changed since 2018 when livestock grazing was reintroduced to the experimental grazing site, and the differences decreased between the sites. As we can see, the net ecosystem exchange in the growing season are statistically different between the sites, while in the dry season no statistical difference was found. So the difference between sites occurred during the growing season, while during the dry seasons our ecosystems acted similarly. Let's continue with cumulative net ecosystem exchange. And first of all, here we can nicely observe correlation between the annual precipitation pattern and the annual carbon balances. Also, we can see that throughout the measurement period, the experimental grazing site had increased carbon sequestration compared to the linear grazing site. The linear grazing site acted as a carbon source for 3 years, while the experimental site became a carbon source for only 2 years with a lower carbon release. And here we have 4 years mean and 4 years cumulative net ecosystem exchange for both studied sites. After 4 years of measurement, control grazing site or linear grazing site come out as a carbon source ecosystem with 82 grams of carbon release, while overgrazed in the past or experimental grazing site resulted as a carbon sink ecosystem with 36 grams of carbon uptake. Also, in the first 2 years of measurements, the difference between the sites was statistically significant, with 84 grams of carbon release for the LG side or linear grazing side and 4 grams of carbon uptake for the experimental grazing side. Whereas in the last 2 years of measurements, the difference in carbon exchange was no longer statistically significant. As a conclusion, we found a significant difference between a site under linear grazing and a site that had been previously overgrazed but rested for 10 years. Surprisingly, the previously overgrazed site was a larger carbon sink than the linear grazing site. But when livestock grazing were reintroduced, the differences became insignificant. It appears that optimally managed sites with regards to a higher abundance of palatable grasses may be favorable for sustainable grazing, but less efficient for net carbon sequestration. So that's all what I wanted to say, and last but not least, thank you all for your attention and bye bye!